This is the S&P Standard & Poor 500 stock price index, and it's used as a benchmark for returns. So this is what you did if you just invested in the whole market monthly from 2000 to 2016. And what it shows is quite a roller coaster ride of value, right? So actually, I should have maybe plotted it longer. It was rising for a long time before that. And then it had a huge drop from 100. It fell about in half. And then starting in 2003, it started a long increase again. And then here's the great financial crisis, 2007 to 2009. And then since then, it's been going up a lot here. You know, from here to here, this is 2009. From here to here, it tripled in value. It's amazingly unstable, this stock market. To think that the risk of any other company, the law of large numbers is not working here, because this is the Standard & Poor 500 index. It's an average of 500 stocks. So if they were all independent of each other, the law of large numbers would make the stock market as a whole almost constant. But in fact, it's actually gone up hugely. So there's definite dependence across stocks. But I'm not going to be focusing on forecasting the stock market here. We're going to make the assumption that it's very hard to forecast. So we're going to look at risk as something that we can quantify by looking at the standard deviation of past risks and not focus on what's new right now. Now, what I want to do next is to look at one firm within the S&P 500. What do you think it looks like if I were to plot Apple on the same chart here? Did you ever heard anything about how they've performed? What's that? Does anyone know how Apple has performed since 2000? I guess we're not an eager class of stock market devotees. Yes, you do. Yeah.
Pretty well since the release of the iPhone. That's around 2007.
He said pretty well since the release of the iPhone. Was it 2007? They did a series of releases of new, different models. You're right, they did pretty well. So I'll show you what pretty well means. Now I'm going to superimpose on this same plot Apple, okay? That's Apple. It looks different because I had to scale it down to fit Apple onto it. So this is quite a good performance because I rescaled both of them to start it at 100, and it's now at, what is that, 3,500, 3,600, something like that. So that means let's say a 40-fold increase in value in 15 years. So imagine that you were taking this class in 2000. I was teaching this class, that would be 15 years ago. But imagine that you were taking this class then, and you came home to your parents and said, you know, I think Apple stock is a great investment. I just have a quick request of you. Could you take out a second mortgage on the house, borrow $400,000, and put it into Apple stock? Well, if you did that in 2000, your parents would now own over $15 million. The problem is, what's the problem with that? The problem is nobody knows the future. If you knew that Apple was going to do that, you would have obviously done this, but nobody knew that Apple was going to do that. So you would also face some problems with your parents if you did that, because starting in 2000, Apple dropped quite a bit, and you lost, looks like 3/4 of your money. It's hard to tell here, right? It was really limping along for 4 years. So you come back 4 years later, and your parents say, do you realize what you did? You made us borrow $400,000, and we're down to $100,000. But then you'd have to be convincing again. No, just hang in there. This is the problem with investing. Hang in there, please. And then it started recovering slowly. So yeah, I think back then, this was before the iPhone, here back in 2001, 2, and 3. So it looked like Apple was washed up. And when did they bring Steve Jobs back? Anyone know that? Anyone read about it? I'm assuming you know who Steve Jobs is. Steve Jobs was the founder of Apple Corporation, and he was kind of a difficult guy and kind of quirky, so they fired him. It was his own company, but you can get fired from your own company. And they put in some professional management, whereas he was kind of a little bit strange. The professional management did this. They brought it down to a low value. And then they invited Steve Jobs back. They thought maybe he does have some kind of genius. But they're still doing well after his death. So maybe it's, a company develops a sort of culture and esprit that allows them to keep doing. I really think that's true about organizations. They go on for so long, sometimes as a great success. So for example, The Economist magazine was founded in London in the early 19th century. And it was, it's still a great magazine. How can they last so long? I went and visited them once, and I discovered that they don't even put bylines. They have a different culture. They usually don't put bylines on articles. In other words, if you go to work for The Economist as a writer, you will not become known. They will not put your name, print your name on the articles you write. So how can they do that? Because young people want to establish themselves somehow. But they do. And there's a different culture at The Economist magazine as a result. So every company has its own culture, and it produces these strange outlier effects. This is the return on Apple stock in red, the red dashed line, and the return on the S&P Standard & Poor 500 stock price index. So you can see that the returns on Apple have been very variable, much more variable than the return on the S&P 500. In fact, when you look at this, it's hard to judge from this picture which one did better, right? It looks like Apple is going up and down all the time. It's this noisy, really noisy. And this aggregate stock market looks tame by comparison. It's hard for you to judge which one did better, but you see, maybe if you look, you can sort of tell that there are more ups than downs. But it's so noisy from month to month. These are monthly returns. So here Apple lost almost 60% in 1 month. So it was horrible. The other thing is, I don't know if you can tell that it's correlated with the S&P 500, that when the S&P 500 moves up, it moves up. And when the S&P 500 is down. For example, but see, this is the experience of investing is puzzling because the noise dominates. It's just so scary watching these things go up. And if you take an interesting investment like Apple, it just goes up and down so much from month to month. And it can be under for years. And you can really lose faith in your acumen after it's gone badly for years. So this is just the variance of Apple versus the variance of S&P 500. The standard deviation of Apple capital gain was 12.8 cents a month. That's not annualizing. Annualizing means multiplying it by 12. This is a scatter diagram showing the returns on the S&P 500 on the horizontal axis and the returns on Apple on the vertical axis. And you can see that the scatter has an upward slope to it, which means they're correlated. But it's not that strong an upward slope. So, but when S&P is high, Apple tends to be high in return. And when S&P is low, Apple tends to be low. But it's more variable. Well, this goes from plus 60 to minus 80. And on this axis, I have minus 50 to plus 50. So Apple is more variable than S&P 500. But you can see that there's a correlation. Actually, it's better if I put a regression line in. This is a line fitted through the scatter of points. And it shows, it has a slope of 1.45, which is greater than 1, which means that Apple overreacts to what happens in the aggregate stock market. And then it has noise on top of that, Apple noise, like Steve Jobs' death noise that doesn't affect the overall stock market. So Apple actually so this is going to be a fundamental concept in this course. The beta of a stock is a measure of how it relates to the stock market. If the beta is 1, then the asset tends to go up and down 1 for 1 in terms of returns with the aggregate market. If the beta is 2, they're kind of rare to see beta 2 stocks. Beta 1.45 is getting high. So Apple reacts more than directly to the stock market. So when times are good, people think they're really good for Apple. And when times are bad, they think it's really bad for Apple. Well, the concept here is market risk versus idiosyncratic risk. So market risk is the risk of the whole stock market. And for an Apple investment, the market risk of that investment is the risk that Apple will do something in reaction to the aggregate stock market. But idiosyncratic risk is Apple-only risk. So that would be the death of Steve Jobs, or the iFlop, the iPhone that nobody liked that occurred once. So they make mistakes, and they take risks. The people at Apple have a history of taking risks. They'll try something that might not work out. That's how they don't always work out, but on average they do. So the variance of the return on a stock is equal to its beta squared times the variance of the market return, and that's called systematic risk, plus the variance of the residual in the regression, the residual in this regression. I think some of this might be, our graduate students can clarify some of these concepts for you.
A regression line is a single line that best fits the data in your scatter plot. So how is this calculated? Imagine you have a scatter plot with 50 dots and you start by drawing a line through them. The vertical distance between a given dot and the regression line is that dot's residual, also known as the error of your proposed line with regards to that single dot. So to get a better fit, I can try changing the slope or constant parameter to force the line to go perfectly through dots 1 and 2, but that'll make the residual associated with dot 3 really big. So what do? We want to minimize some combination of all 50 residuals. So statistics proposes the least squares method. What do the different slopes mean? Remember the equation for a line in algebra class, y is equal to mx plus b? The slope m is how much y changes for a 1 unit increase in x. In finance, we call y as the return on Apple stock, x as the return on the market, slope m as beta, and the constant b as alpha. Slope beta tells how much a particular stock co-moves with the market, and thus is a measure of the stock's systematic risk.
So the idiosyncratic risk is the risk that the point will lie above or below the line. And you can see there's a lot of idiosyncratic risk for Apple.